The morning came in slow, the way it always did over the village. First as a paleness behind the ridgeline, then as a thin gold thread along the tiled roofs, and only much later as anything you could call daylight. Kaito was usually awake before all three stages. He liked the quiet of it, the hour when the only sounds were the crows deciding where to start their day and the creak of his own knees as he swung the garage doors open. The garage was small, tucked at the edge of the village where the last of the houses gave way to the shrine road and the hill behind it. It had been his father's before him, and his father's fathers before that, though by now almost nothing of the original building remained except the shape of it. The same low roof, the same wide doorway, the same worn groove in the concrete floor where two generations of mechanics had rolled the same handful of trolleys back and forth a thousand times. Kaito liked that groove. He liked knowing his own feet had worn part of it. He made tea first. He always made tea first. The kettle lived on a little burner in the corner, wedged between a shelf of oil cans and a stack of tires he kept meaning to sort by size and never did. And, while it heated, he walked the length of the garage, running a hand along the tools hung on their pegboard, not checking them, exactly, just touching them, the way you might touch the doorframe of a house you'd lived in a long time. Wrenches, feeler gauges, the old torque wrench with the handle wrapped in tape because the rubber grip had worn through the summer Kaito turned 16, the year his father finally trusted him to work the counter alone. And he'd never replaced it because the tape worked fine and there was no sense fixing what wasn't broken. By the time the tea was ready, the village was starting to wake up around him. He could hear it more than see it from where he sat on the low stool by the door. The Nakamura's rooster, 3 houses down, and horse from years of overuse. The particular rattle of Grandmother Etsu's bicycle as she pedaled past on her way to open the shop. The temple bell up on the hill, rung not for any service, but simply because the old caretaker liked the sound of it in the morning air, and nobody had ever seen fit to stop him. The first customer arrived a little after 8. It was old man Sato's truck, a boxy thing the color of rust, wearing a thin disguise of white paint. And it came into the garage the way it always did, coughing, reluctant, apologizing for itself. "She's making that noise again," Sato said, by way of greeting, easing himself out of the cab with the particular carefulness of a man whose back had opinions about mornings. "The one like a duck, or the one like a duck that's angry about something," Kaito said. "Angrier duck." "Ah." Kaito wiped his hands on the rag that lived permanently in his back pocket and crouched by the front wheel well, already listening before he'd touched anything. "Let's have a look at her, then." This was the part of the work Kaito had never been able to explain to anyone who didn't already understand it. The listening. Any mechanic could learn the steps. Raise the vehicle, check the belts, test the electrics, work down the list until you found the fault. But there was a second way of doing it too, a way that lived somewhere between his ears and his hands, where the engine told you what was wrong before the diagnostics confirmed it, the way an old friend's voice tells you they're tired before they say a word about it. He'd had that ear since he was young. His father used to say, Kaito could diagnose a car by its cough alone. the same way a doctor could diagnose a patient by theirs, and it had never really felt new to him. Even now, growing up with a wrench in his hand made it feel like something he'd always known, sharper each year, quieter, more certain. The angry duck turned out to be a loose heat shield, rattling against the exhaust pipe every time the truck went over a bump, which, around here, was constantly. 10 minutes with a wrench and a new clamp, and the truck went from complaining to merely grumbling, which for a vehicle that old was practically a love song. "You're a miracle worker," Sato said. The same thing he said every single time, and pressed a few bills into Kaito's hand along with, as always, more than the job was worth, and Kaito, as always, pretended not to notice the difference and thanked him for it anyway. The day went on like that. A moped with a stuck choke. A delivery van whose driver wanted to talk about his daughter's wedding the whole time Kaito worked, which Kaito didn't mind. Some jobs were for fixing engines, and some were for fixing engines while somebody talked through something that had nothing to do with engines at all, and Kaito had learned a long time ago that both were part of the same work. A tractor from one of the outlying farms, its hydraulic line patched twice already and needing a third patch that both Kaito and its owner knew was really its last patch, though neither of them said so. By late afternoon, the light through the garage doorway had gone long and amber, the way it did in autumn, laying a warm stripe across the oil-stained floor. Kaito swept up, more out of habit than necessity. The floor of a working garage was never truly clean, just periodically less dirty, and set the tools back on their pegs in the order they belonged, and put the kettle on one more time for a cup he'd drink, standing up while he looked over the next day's ledger. It was fully dark by the time he finished. The village had gone quiet in the particular way it did at night. Lantern light in windows instead of the sun, somebody's dog barking once at nothing and then losing interest. Kaito switched off the work lamp, and the garage fell into the soft grey dark it always sat in when it wasn't being used, familiar as an old coat. He was thinking about very little as he crossed toward the door, whether he had enough rice at home, whether it might rain before the week was out, the small, unimportant thoughts that fill the last minutes of an ordinary day. He did not notice the puddle of oil that had crept over the course of the afternoon from beneath the tractor's leaking hydraulic line to a spot directly in front of the doorway. He had swept the floor. He had not swept that. His foot found it the way feet always find the one thing you didn't check. There was a half-second of pure, undignified surprise. The kind that has no thought in it at all, just the body's flat announcement that the ground is no longer where it's supposed to be. And Kaito's arms went out, and the world tipped, and he had just enough time to think, with the calm irritation of a man who has never once slipped on his own garage floor in his life. Oh, for goodness' sake. And then the dark of the garage was not dark anymore, but a different kind of dark entirely, rushing and full of light at its edges, like falling through the middle of a lantern. The falling went on for longer than falling had any business going on for, long enough that it stopped feeling like falling at all and started feeling like a kind of travel, the lantern light rushing past him in soft gold streaks the way the village's paper lanterns might look if you spun past a whole street of them at once. Kaito did not think much during this part. There did not seem to be much room for thinking. There was only the light and the rushing, and one small, distant, oddly practical part of his mind that noted the way it might note a strange sound in an engine. Well, this is new. And then, all at once, it was not falling anymore. It was stillness, A very specific, very physical stillness, the kind you only really notice once it's arrived. Solid ground under his back, damp and gritty through his shirt, the ordinary ache of a body that has landed somewhere it did not expect to land. He lay there a moment before opening his eyes, the way he'd once lain in bed as a boy after a bad dream, taking inventory before trusting himself to move. Fingers there, toes there, nothing sharp, nothing broken, nothing that ached in a way that suggested a hospital rather than a hot bath. Whatever had happened to him, it did not seem to have happened to his body. The sounds came before he opened his eyes, the way they always did, and Kaito had spent his whole working life learning to trust what he heard before what he saw. There was a low, rhythmic hiss somewhere nearby. Steam, unmistakably, venting on a cycle, 3 counts on and 2 counts off, patient as breathing. Beneath it, a deeper sound, almost too low to hear so much as feel through the ground. A hum, steady and enormous, like standing near the base of something vast and slow and turning. And under all of it, very faint, very far away, the cry of what might have been a gull, if gulls also happened to sound faintly, like a kettle coming to boil. He opened his eyes. The sky above him was not his sky. It was a soft, bruised twilight color, the kind his village only wore for a few minutes at dusk, before the stars came properly out. Except here it seemed to be sitting there permanently, or near enough, lit from somewhere off to one side by a pale green-gold glow that did not behave like any sunset Kaito had ever priced parts by. Something enormous passed overhead while he watched, slow, deliberate, throwing a shadow that took a full 3 seconds to cross him. And it took his mind a moment to assemble the shape into something it recognized. A ship. A ship, sailing through open air, its hull ribbed with brass and its underside strung with lanterns, as unbothered by the lack of water beneath it as a cloud. Kaito looked at it for a while. Then he did the only thing that made sense to him, which was to sit up, brush the grit from his hands, and start checking his surroundings the way he'd check an engine he didn't recognize. Not with alarm, exactly, but with the calm, methodical attention of a man who has learned that most problems reveal themselves if you're patient enough to listen. He was in an alley. That much, at least, was familiar. Every town had alleys, it seemed, wherever this was, narrow and shadowed, walled in on both sides by tall buildings the color of old brass gone soft with weather. Pipework ran up the walls in thick, looping seams, not hidden the way plumbing was hidden back home, but worn openly, proudly almost, like veins on the back of a hand. And here and there, along its length, small glass-fronted housings glowed with that same pale green-gold light, humming faintly, warm to look at, even from a distance. One of them sat close enough that Kaito reached out and touched the glass, carefully, the way he might touch an engine block to gauge whether it was safe. It was warm, not hot. It thrummed very slightly under his fingers, a small, contained kind of aliveness, and for reasons he couldn't have explained, that steadied him more than anything else had since he'd opened his eyes. Whatever this is, he thought, someone built it. Someone maintains it. That's something, at least. He got to his feet slowly, testing his balance, and made his way toward the mouth of the alley, where the twilight opened up into something brighter and busier beyond. The street outside took his breath in a way he wasn't proud of, though he supposed there was no shame in it. A man was allowed to be startled by a city that had airships moored to its rooftops like carriages tied to a post. It was not so different from a market day back home, if he squinted and ignored nearly everything about it. Stalls lining both sides of a wide cobbled avenue, awnings snapping gently in a breeze that smelled of hot metal and something spiced he couldn't place. The general good-natured noise of people going about the business of being alive. But everywhere he looked, the ordinary and the impossible sat side by side without any apparent argument between them. A woman haggling over the price of what looked like ordinary turnips, with a mechanical bird the size of a sparrow perched on her shoulder, preening brass feathers with a beak that clicked. A boy running past with a hoop and stick. Except the hoop glowed faintly and hummed when it rolled. A whole row of shop fronts with signs written in looping script that Kaito, to his quiet astonishment, found he could read without difficulty, though he could not have said in what language. A few people glanced his way as he stood there at the alley's mouth, taking it all in. An odd sight, he supposed. A man in a flannel shirt and denim overalls, with old-world tools still hanging half out of his back pocket, gawking like a tourist. But the glances were curious rather than wary, the way you might glance at a stranger's unfamiliar dog rather than a stranger's unfamiliar face. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked him anything. The city simply went on being the city and left him room to stand in it and catch up. He might have stood there a good while longer, working up the nerve to actually walk into the thick of it if it hadn't been for the sound. It came from somewhere off to his left, down a narrower side street. He hadn't noticed till his ear caught it, as if it familiar, as if his whole body turned toward it before his mind had finished deciding to. The clean, ringing clank of a wrench striking metal, followed by a muttered word he didn't need to understand to recognize as the universal sound of somebody's hand slipping off a stubborn bolt. Beneath it a low, uneven hiss, a valve sticking, venting when it shouldn't, and Kaito, since earhood, trained since boyhood on exactly that kind of small, unhappy noise, diagnosed it without being asked to, needs repacking before it goes. He stood, very still, listening, and felt something in his chest loosen slightly for the first time since he'd opened his eyes on the cold stone of that alley. He did not know. He did not know where he was. He did not know how he had gotten here or how he was meant to get home, or whether home was even a sensible word to be using at the moment. But that sound, that particular unhappy little hiss of a seal about to fail, was a sound he understood as well as his own name, in this world or any other, and it pulled at him the way the smell of tea pulled at him on a cold morning. Kaito adjusted the tools still tucked in his back pocket, squared his shoulders in the mildly embarrassed way of a man about to do something he can't fully justify, and started walking toward the sound. The side street was narrower than the one he'd left, close enough that the buildings on either side seemed to lean toward each other overhead, and it took Kaito only a few dozen steps to find what he was looking for. Though find wasn't quite right, since the thing announced itself well before he saw it. A cart sat abandoned in the middle of the lane, low and boxy, riding on 4 thick wheels with a boiler mounted where a horse's harness might once have gone, and from somewhere along its brass flank came the same unhappy hiss he'd heard from 2 streets away, now close enough to feel as a fine, warm mist against his shins. Nobody was minding it. That was the detail his hands noticed before his head did, and by the time his head caught up, his hands were already crouched at the cart's side, fingers walking the seams of the boiler, housing the way they'd walk the seams of any engine that couldn't tell him where it hurt. There, a fitting near the base, weeping steam in short, irregular gasps instead of venting clean, exactly the soft, failing seal he'd diagnosed from 2 streets away. Except, now that he was close enough to fix it, he realized with a small sinking feeling that he did not have the first idea how. It wasn't that the problem was strange. The problem was achingly familiar. a fitting that needed repacking, work he could have done blind back home. It was the tools that were strange. A leather roll lay open on the cobbles nearby, clearly left by whoever should have been minding this cart, and the instruments in it were both entirely wrong and entirely, tauntingly close to right. A wrench-shaped thing with a spiral grip that turned the opposite direction from any wrench he'd ever held. A pair of pliers with some kind of small brass dial built into the handle that he didn't dare touch without knowing what it did. He picked up the wrench-shaped thing anyway, because his hands apparently did not believe in waiting for permission, and turned it over twice, and had just gotten it more or less oriented over the fitting when a voice behind him said, with the particular flat calm of someone who has walked in on something they did not expect to see, "That's not yours." Kaito went very still, the wrench-shaped thing hovering uselessly over the fitting, and turned around with the specific guilt of a man caught red-handed doing exactly what it looked like he was doing. The young woman standing at the mouth of the alley behind him had her arms crossed, and a look on her face that was somewhere between suspicion and open curiosity, the two of them not quite deciding which would win. Short, dark hair, choppy in a way that looked more practical than fashionable, a pair of brass-rimmed goggles pushed down around her neck, and hands, he noticed this the way he noticed most things about people, hands first, that were calloused and faintly stained at the knuckles in a way that told him everything about her before she'd said a second word. "No," Kaito agreed, setting the tool down very carefully, as if that might undo the last 30 seconds. "It's not. I'm sorry. I heard the seal going, and I suppose I just..." She didn't move for a moment, studying him the way he imagined he must look. A stranger in clothes that weren't cut like anyone's around here, crouched over someone else's cart with someone else's tools. Saying, "I heard the seal going," like that was an ordinary thing to say to a stranger in an alley. Then, slowly, the suspicion in her face lost its footing to the curiosity. Aunt said, "You heard it from where?" "The main street. Maybe 2 of them back." "That's not possible." She said it plainly, not as an accusation, more the way Kaito might have said, "That's not possible," to an engine that was making a noise its parts didn't account for. She crouched down across from him, peering at the fitting herself, and after a moment added, almost reluctantly, "It is the seal, though," Clydely essayed. "Pressure seal. Going soft. Not gone yet. You'll get another day or 2 out of it if you don't push the boiler hard. But it wants repacking properly before it fails on you somewhere inconvenient." He heard himself say it and felt the familiar, small satisfaction of a correct diagnosis, followed almost immediately by the much less familiar feeling of having no idea what to do next with that information, in a world where he didn't know which end of the pliers was which. "You're a mechanic." "I am. Just not one who knows what any of this is." Something in her face shifted then. Not suspicion exactly, and not quite delight either, but close cousin to both. She held out her hand, not for a handshake, but palm up, waiting, and after a beat Kaito realized she meant the tool and passed it back to her. "Watch!" and turned it the way it was meant to turn, seating it over the fitting with a small, practiced twist of her wrist. "It's threaded backward from what you're used to, probably. Most old tech is, this far up the works. Has to do with how the aether lines were run originally, or so I've been told. Nobody really remembers why anymore. We just build to match. She loosened the fitting, drew a thin ring of packing material from a pouch on her belt, and held it out to him without looking up. Here, you clearly know what this needs, even if you don't know what it's called. Pack it. Kaito took the ring of material, soft, waxy, not unlike the packing he'd used 100 times back home, close enough that his hands knew exactly what to do with it, even in a shape they'd never held, and set to work while she held the fitting steady, and for a little while neither of them said anything at all. It was, Kaito thought, a remarkably comfortable kind of quiet. The specific quiet of two people who trusted each other's hands without needing to trust anything else yet. There, when it was done, and she tested the seal with a small pump of a lever he hadn't noticed until she used it. The hiss cut off clean, replaced by the same patient 3-count breathing he'd heard from 2 streets away. Healthy now, instead of failing. Huh. Sitting back on her heels and looking at him properly for the first time since she'd caught him red-handed. So, who are you? It was, Kaito reflected, an entirely fair question, and he still didn't have a good answer to it. That, is said, is a longer story than I think either of us has time for right now. My name's Kaito. I had a very strange night, and I woke up in an alley about 2 streets from here, and I don't know how I got to your city, or your... is this even your world? I don't know how to ask that politely. He rubbed the back of his neck. I'm a mechanic. That part, at least, I'm sure of. She should have looked more alarmed by this than she did. He'd half braced for it, the raised voice, the call for a constable, whatever the local equivalent might be. Instead, she just studied him for a moment longer, the way she might study a piece of machinery doing something it technically shouldn't be able to do, and then, unexpectedly, she grinned.
That, he said, is the most interesting thing that's happened to me all month. I'm Wren. This is my cart, well, my master's cart. I just do the fixing. And if you really don't know where you are, you're going to want someone to show you around before you wander into the works district and start diagnosing things by ear, because people will think you're either a genius or a lunatic, and it usually takes them a while to decide which.
She stood, brushing off her knees, and held a hand down to help him up. An ordinary gesture that he took as exactly what it was, the first small kindness of an entirely unfamiliar day. Come on, you can tell me the strange night story properly. I want to hear how a man ends up 2 streets over with no idea what a packing seal looks like, but every idea how to use one. Kaito took her hand and let her pull him to his feet, and found, a little to his own surprise, that he was smiling. The works district, it turned out, had a rhythm to it, the way any place did once you'd been in it long enough to stop being dazzled and start actually looking. And Wren, walking a half step ahead of him with her hands tucked in her coverall pockets, clearly knew that rhythm the way Kaito knew the particular creak of his own garage doors. She didn't so much walk through the district as move with it, timing her steps around a hissing vent here, a swinging crane arm there, without appearing to notice she was doing either. Aether Works is the tall one, she said, nodding toward a tower at the district's center that Kaito had been quietly trying not to stare at since they'd rounded the corner. A structure of dark iron and pale glass, wrapped in slow spirals of glowing conduit, humming with the same deep note he'd felt through the ground back in the alley. That's the heart of everything you're looking at. Aether comes up out of the wellspring under the district, gets refined and pressurized in there, and then it's piped out through the whole works to run, well, everything. Boilers, lifts, the street lamps, the ferries down at the canal. You've got steam where you're from? We have steam, Kaito said. We have oil and petrol and things that burn to make heat and pistons that turn the heat into motion. That's about the whole of it. Huh. She considered this the way she'd considered the packing seal. Turning it over, testing its shape. So no aether at all. That must make everything so much heavier. Half of what runs here only works because the aether cuts the weight of it. That's what the pressure runes are for, mostly. Not the flashy stuff people think. See there? She pointed at a length of pipe running along a nearby wall, etched every few feet with a small, precise symbol that glowed faintly blue where the metal met it. Those aren't decoration. They're regulating flow, keeping the pressure where it needs to be without needing a valve every few feet. My master says the old builders worked it out so the pipes basically think a little about how hard they're working. I don't fully understand the how of it. I just know which ones to replace when they go dull. That, Kaito said, sounds considerably more elegant than a pressure gauge. Depends who you ask. Gauges don't need re-inscribing every few years. And inscribing's expensive and slow, and if you get a stroke wrong, the whole rune just stops. No warning. So there's an argument either way. She said it with the easy, slightly weary authority of someone repeating an argument she'd heard adults have a dozen times over, and Kaito, listening, found himself smiling at how much it reminded him of Old Man Sato's opinions about fuel injection versus carburetors. An argument that had apparently been raging in his own village for 30 years and would probably outlive them both. They walked on. Wren pointed things out as they came to them, half tour guide and half, Kaito suspected, someone glad of an excuse to talk about the things she loved to someone who was actually listening. The canal at the district's eastern edge, where flat-bottomed ferries hauled cargo along on nothing but current and a bit of ether-assisted lift. A foundry where the heat came off the open doorway in a wave he could feel from 30 feet away. Workers moving through it with the unhurried confidence of people who'd made peace with the temperature years ago. A market stall selling something skewered and glazed that smelled astonishingly almost exactly like the grilled sweet potatoes sold outside his own village's shrine on festival nights, and which Wren bought 2 of without asking, handing one over with the brisk, unceremonious generosity of someone who did this sort of thing often. Kaito told her the story as they went, in pieces, between her explanations, the garage, the tractor's leaking line, the puddle he hadn't swept, the fall that had felt like tumbling through the middle of a lantern. She listened to all of it with her head tilted slightly, chewing thoughtfully, and asked exactly the kind of questions Kaito would have asked himself. Not is this real, but does it happen often? Does anyone else know how? Is there a pattern to it? The questions of someone who solved problems for a living and assumed, reasonably, that most problems had a mechanism if you looked hard enough. So you don't know how to get back, she said eventually, matter of fact rather than pitying, which he appreciated more than he could easily have said. No idea at all. That's not nothing, is what I mean. But you fixed a seal you'd never seen before inside of 2 minutes, so I wouldn't bet against you figuring this out either, eventually. In the meantime, you clearly know your way around an engine, even if you don't know your way around this engine. And I clearly know this engine, but I'll be honest, I've been stuck on some things a proper diagnostic ear might sort out in an afternoon. Seems like a fair trade, if you're not in any hurry to be anywhere else. I'm not in a hurry. I don't have anywhere else to be. That's rather the trouble. Then it's settled. My workshop's just up here. It's not much. I mostly do the running repairs my master doesn't have time for. Small work, nothing glamorous. But it's dry, and there's a kettle, and you look like a man who could use a sit-down and a cup of something hot after the night you've had. The workshop, when they reached it, was smaller than Kaito had pictured. tucked into a narrow storefront between a locksmith's and a shuttered bakery, its windows fogged faintly from the warmth inside. Wren pushed the door open with her shoulder, the way you push open a door you've pushed open 10,000 times before. And the smell that met him, hot metal, machine oil, the particular mineral tang of ether he was already starting to recognize, was different from his own garage in every specific way, and somehow, underneath all of it, exactly the same. "Sit anywhere," Wren said, already moving toward a kettle balanced on a small ether-fed burner in the corner, in a gesture so precisely like his own morning ritual back home that Kaito had to stand still for a moment just to let it land. "Kettle's quick here, at least. Whatever else this world's short on, it's not short on hot water." Kaito looked around the small, cluttered, lantern-lit room, the tools he half recognized and half didn't, the half-finished projects lined up along one wall, the faint, healthy hum of ether running somewhere behind the plaster, and sat down on the stool she nodded him toward, feeling, for the first time since he'd opened his eyes in that alley, something almost like being somewhere. The tea, when it came, was pale gold and faintly bitter, and tasted of nothing Kaito could name. And he drank it anyway, sitting on his borrowed stool in the lantern light while Wren moved around the small workshop, gathering up whatever it was she meant to show him. Outside, the district's evening noise had settled into something lower and slower. The foundries banking their fires, the airships easing into their moorings for the night, the whole place exhaling the way his own village exhaled once the last customer's truck had rattled off down the road. "Here," Wren said, setting a small brass housing on the workbench between them, about the size of a lantern and twice as heavy-looking, its casing scored with the same faint blue-lit runes he'd seen on the pipework outside. "This is what I've been stuck on. It's a calibration core. Feeds the pressure runes their instructions, more or less. Tells them how hard to work and when. This one's been running rough for a week. I've reinscribed the primary rune twice. Hasn't helped." Kaito turned the housing over in his hands, slow and careful, the way he'd turn over an alternator he didn't recognize, running his thumb along the seams, tapping two knuckles lightly against the casing and listening to the note it gave back. It didn't tell him anything specific. The language of it was still foreign to him, all runes and ether where he wanted wires and vacuum lines. But it told him something, the way any object told you something if you were patient enough to ask properly. And patience with objects that couldn't tell you what was wrong was the one thing Kaito had never once run short of. "Play it for me," he said. "Play it? However you'd normally listen to it working. I don't know what your version of listening looks like yet. Show me." Wren considered this for a moment, then reached over and set a small dial on the housing's side, and the core hummed to life between them. Not smoothly, Kaito noticed immediately, but with a faint, irregular stutter underneath the hum, there and gone, there and gone. So quiet he might have missed it if he hadn't spent his whole working life training himself to hear exactly that kind of hesitation. "There," he said. "Hear that? Under the main note. It catches every—" He counted silently, tapping two fingers against his knee. "Every seventh beat or so. Regular. That's not the rune misfiring. That's something mechanical, further down, that the rune's compensating for and just barely managing." Wren went very still, head tilted, listening the way he'd taught himself to listen a lifetime ago in a garage on the other side of somewhere. "I don't hear it." "You will. Give it a minute." He didn't rush her, just let the core hum on between them, patient. the way his father had once been patient with him over an engine that wouldn't idle right all those years ago. And then he saw the exact moment it landed. Her eyes widening slightly, her hand coming up without her seeming to notice, tapping the same seventh beat rhythm against her own knee. There, oh, there it is. How did you... She looked at him with something between delight and mild betrayal. I've had this thing apart 4 times and I never caught that. You were listening for the rune. I wasn't listening for anything specific. So I heard everything. He handed the housing back to her. Now, what's underneath the rune assembly? Mechanically, I mean. What could stutter on a 7 count? It took them the better part of an hour to find it. A small feed valve buried under 2 layers of casing, worn just enough to hesitate on every 7th cycle of whatever internal rhythm the core kept. And the finding of it was, Kaito thought, one of the more purely satisfying hours he'd spent in longer than he could remember. Wren did the actual disassembly, hands quick and certain in a way his own weren't yet, showing him as she went which fittings turned which direction, which seals needed replacing on schedule, and which would outlast them both. And Kaito, for his part, kept his ear on the core the whole time, calling out small corrections. Tighter. That's not seated right. Listen. Do you hear how that changed the note? Until between the 2 of them, working in the kind of comfortable, wordless rhythm that Kaito associated with very old friendships, and was faintly startled to find himself falling into within a single afternoon, the valve came free, was replaced, and the core, when Wren set the dial again, hummed back to life, clean and even, no stutter at all. That's it, Wren said, quietly, turning the housing over in the lamplight to admire it the way Kaito admired a well-running engine. That's actually it. A week, and it took you... She shook her head. You really do just listen, don't you? Not the way I listen. Underneath it. It's the only trick I've got, Kaito said, and meant it more honestly than the small joke let on. Your turn to teach me one, though. That rune you re-inscribed. Show me properly. I want to understand what I was hearing you fix. So she did, then unspooling the whole slow craft of it while a second pot of tea went cold between them. The fine engraving tools, no larger than a pen, that cut the rune strokes into brass, the particular order the strokes had to follow, not for decoration but because each line fed logic into the next. A kind of written instruction that Kaito, listening, began to understand not as magic exactly, but as a language of pure function, not so different in spirit from the wiring diagrams he'd spent a lifetime reading, just written in curves instead of lines. She let him try a practice stroke on a scrap of brass, guided his hand when the angle came out wrong, laughed not unkindly when his first attempt came out crooked enough that the little test rune sputtered and died the instant she powered it. You'll get it, she said, taking the scrap back from him and setting a second one down in its place. Everyone's first rune looks like a spider had an argument with a fence post. Try again. He tried again. It came out straighter. Not right, not yet, but straighter, and something in him, some old patient part that had learned to weld a straight seam only after a dozen crooked ones, recognized the shape of learning something properly, slowly, with somebody who didn't mind watching you get it wrong on the way to getting it right. They kept at it long past when the light outside had gone fully to lantern glow, trading back and forth. His ear for her runes for his ear, small pieces of 2 very different kinds of knowledge passing between them so easily that Kaito, when he finally noticed the hour, was almost startled by how much of the evening had simply gone. My master's away most of this month, Wren said at one point, apropos of not very much, in the offhand tone of someone mentioning something they'd decided long ago not to mind out loud. Business up at the Aether wellspring. It's usually just me down here, minding the shop, taking the jobs he doesn't have time for. It's fine. I like the quiet. She glanced at Kaito sideways over the little brass rune she was rescoring. It's just been a while since anyone was actually around for it is all. He understood something about quiet garages and the particular shape of a life built around work you loved and did mostly alone. Didn't try to fill the silence that came after that with anything clumsy. He just nodded and said, "I know that one," and let it sit between them, honest and unfussed, the way the best kinds of understanding usually did. It was Wren, eventually, who broke the quiet, standing to stretch with a small groan and glancing at the district's darkened window, as if remembering something. "We should stop for tonight. You'll want sleep, wherever you end up sleeping, and I've got the Lantern Festival bearing down on me whether I'm ready or not." She said it lightly, but a small crease appeared between her eyebrows that hadn't been there a moment before. The Old Ferry Clock down at the canal crossing is supposed to ring the district in for it, same as it has every year since before I was apprenticed. It's been running slow for a month and nobody's had time to look at it properly. If it stops before the festival, half the district's going to be furious with me somehow, even though it's not remotely my job to fix a public clock. Kaito looked at her for a moment, feeling the shape of an idea settle into place the way a part settles into a socket it was built for. "Sounds," he said, "like exactly the kind of thing two mechanics with an evening free might be able to look at." They went the next evening, once the day's ordinary work was done. Wren had insisted on that much, over Kaito's mild protests, on the grounds that a tired mechanic made careless mistakes, and a public clock tower was no place to learn that lesson. So it was dusk again, the district's lanterns just beginning to catch, when the two of them made their way down to the canal crossing where the ferry clock stood. It was, Kaito thought, one of the loveliest things he'd seen since he'd arrived. A tower of pale stone and dark brass rising up from the canal's edge, its great round face lit softly from within, ringed by a lower gallery of smaller dials that he guessed, correctly as it turned out, tracked the ferry schedules for each of the canal's crossings. Aether conduit wound up its height in the same slow spirals as the works tower across the district, and at its base, worn smooth by what must have been generations of hands, a plaque in the same looping script he'd learned to half read, named it, as near as he could make out, something like the Wayfarer's Hour. An old man was waiting for them at the tower's base, sweeping the same stretch of cobblestone with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had swept it every evening for decades, and would keep sweeping it long after any dirt had given up and gone elsewhere. He looked up as they approached, and his face creased and weathered in a way Kaito found he missed seeing. After 2 days, surrounded by people his own age, broke into something warm and relieved all at once. "Wren, you've finally come to look at her then. She's been running slow, near a full turn of the minute dial a day. I've been telling the district council for a month, but everyone's too busy with festival preparations to spare a mechanic, and I'm afraid I'm only good for sweeping and worrying these days. Friend of yours?"
Something like that. This is Kaito. He's got an ear for engines like nobody I've ever met. Kaito, this is Pharaoh. He's kept the Wayfarer's Hour longer than I've been alive.
Kept her company, more like. Never had the training to actually fix her. That was always someone else's job. And lately, there hasn't been a someone else. Go on then, if you're going to. I'll keep the lanterns lit for you.
Here, feel this tooth. Third one from the mark.
Kaito ran a thumb along it and felt immediately what she meant. A tooth worn down just fractionally more than its neighbors. Not broken, not dangerous, just tired. The kind of small mechanical unfairness that happened to anything that turned enough times over enough years. That's your slow minute dial. Every time this tooth comes round, it's catching just a hair short. Add that up over a whole day and you'd lose what? A minute? Little more? A minute, near enough. Wren traced the rune work running just above the wheel with her lantern light, frowning slightly. But that's not the whole of it. This regulation rune should be correcting for exactly that kind of small wear. That's half of what it's for. Keeping the timing honest even as the gears age. It's not doing its job. Look, it's gone dull here and here. She pointed to two faint hairline breaks in the glowing lattice, so fine Kaito would never have spotted them on his own. Old inscription, cracking with age. It's not compensating anymore. Hasn't been for a while, probably, and the gear wear's only just caught up enough for anyone to notice. Kaito sat back on his heels, looking at the two problems together, the worn gear that needed a mechanic's hands and the failing rune that needed hers, and felt something settle into place with the quiet satisfaction of a diagnosis that finally, fully made sense. So it wants both of us, he said. It wants both of us. Wren looked at him, lantern light catching the small, pleased spark in her eyes that he was beginning to recognize as her version of excitement. I can reinscribe the rune. That's slow work, but I know how. You'll need to true up the gear, or replace the tooth outright if you can manage it without pulling the whole wheel, because I don't have a spare this old lying around, and neither does anyone else in the district, probably. I can true it without replacing it. Might take most of the night, done carefully. But a worn tooth can be built back up and reshaped if you've got the patience for it. I have the patience for it. Do you?
I reinscribed a full backup rune set for a festival lantern line once, over 2 nights, because I was too stubborn to admit I was tired. I think I can manage 1 clock. Two days until the festival. Plenty of time, if neither of us gets clever and tries to rush it.
Plenty of time. The 2 days passed the way good, absorbing work always did. Quickly in the looking back and slowly in the living through. 1 careful hour folding into the next. Spent long stretches of both evenings crouched at the escapement wheel, building the worn tooth back up in fine layers and reshaping it by hand until it matched its neighbors so closely that only his fingertips could tell the difference. Wren spent hers bent over the regulation rune, with her smallest engraving pen, retracing the cracked lines stroke by patient stroke, testing and retesting until the lattice glowed clean and even from end to end. Pharaoh brought them tea he'd clearly made too strong on purpose for the concentration, and sat on his bench outside the chamber door both nights, humming his same soft, tuneless little song, content to keep them company through the wall until, sometime past midnight on the second night, Wren set her pen down and said, very quietly, "That's the last stroke." They tested it together, the way they'd learned to test everything together over the past 2 days. Kaito with his ear to the housing, Wren with her hand on the dial. The old gears turned. The rune work pulsed once, twice, and settled into a steady, even glow. And the Wayfarer's hour, for the first time in a month, ticked forward on time, clean and certain, no hitch, no hesitation, no 7th beat stutter hiding underneath. Pharaoh, when they told him, didn't say anything for a moment. He just climbed the narrow stair himself, slower than either of them, and stood in front of the great dial with his hands folded behind his back, watching the minute hand sweep forward in one smooth, honest motion, the way it apparently hadn't in longer than he'd let on. "Well," he said eventually, and cleared his throat, and didn't quite manage to hide how thick his voice had gone. "Well, then, good." The festival came the following evening, and the district turned itself out for it properly. Lanterns strung between every rooftop and over the canal itself. Small paper ones set adrift on the water to bob and glow their way toward the crossing. Stalls doing brisk business in skewered sweets and spiced cider. Somewhere a string band playing something quick and cheerful that had half the younger children of the district spinning in circles they'd regret later. Kaito, standing at the edge of it all with a cup of the cider warming his hands, found the whole scene struck him with a specific, quiet ache of recognition. Not identical to his own village's festival nights, not the same lanterns or the same songs, but close enough in its shape, in the particular way a whole town leaned into one evening of light and noise together, that for a moment he could have been standing at the edge of the shrine road back home watching his neighbors do exactly this. "You're doing the thing again," Wren said, appearing at his elbow with two more skewers, one of which she hadn't asked if he wanted and handed over anyway, the staring off thing. "You did it the whole walkover." "It reminds me of home," Kaito admitted. "Not exactly, just enough." She didn't say anything clever back to that, which he'd come to learn was her particular way of taking something seriously. She just stood with him a moment, watching the lanterns drift, until the crowd around the canal crossing began to hush and turn, all at once, toward the tower. The wayfarer's hour struck the hour clean, right on the mark, its low brass chime rolling out over the water, and the crowd and the whole lit-up evening. And the district. Kaito understood this instantly, the way you understand any ritual you're witnessing for the first time but recognize in your bones, did what it apparently always did at that sound. Everyone, all at once, lifted whatever lantern or candle or cup of cider they were holding just slightly toward the tower, a small collective salute to an old clock that had, for one more year, kept its promise. Pharaoh, down at the tower's base, was beaming so hard Kaito could see it from 50 feet away. "That's new," Wren murmured, watching him. "The looking up thing, people started doing that when I was small, after she nearly stopped for good one winter and old Pharaoh managed some kind of stopgap fix to keep her going. I don't know if anyone remembers why anymore, they just do it." She glanced at him sideways. "Kind of nice, isn't it? Fixing something people don't even remember needing fixed. They just know it's supposed to work." "That's most of the job in my experience," Kaito said. "Nobody thanks you for the diagnosis. They thank the truck for starting." "I'll thank you," Wren said, simply, and bumped her shoulder lightly against his, and went back to watching the lanterns before he could think of anything to say to that. They found a quiet step above the crowd a little while later, away from the thick of the noise but close enough to still hear the music and watch the lanterns drift, and sat there together with the last of the cider between them, the way Kaito imagined he'd have sat on the low stool outside his own garage on any ordinary evening, except that nothing about tonight had been ordinary. And he found, turning that thought over, that he didn't much mind. "I still don't know how I'm getting home, or if I even can." "No, you probably don't. For what it's worth, I'm not in any hurry to find out either way. The shop could use a second pair of hands." And I could use the company, honestly. It's been quiet a long time. I'd like that, the company. Whatever else sorts itself out. I'd like that part regardless. Wren smiled. Not the quick, sharp grin she'd given him back at the cart, but something slower and steadier, and didn't say anything else, because there didn't seem to be anything else that needed saying. Above them, the wayfarer's hour ticked on, patient and even and exactly on time, and below them the lanterns kept drifting down the dark water one by one, unhurried, toward wherever the canal eventually carried them, and Kaito sat and watched them go, warm and tired in the particular, satisfied way of a man who has done good work and found, entirely by accident, somewhere worth doing it, and let his eyes drift shut just for a moment, listening to the music and the water and the steady, healthy tick of the clock, and did not, for the first time since he'd fallen through the middle of a lantern, feel the smallest need to hurry toward anywhere else at all.